Thank you very much for attending today. I got really excited that things were going to change about 5 years ago. So this is the culmination of being early for something, first time in my life, and working very hard to understand these new disruptive models. So I'm really pleased to bring everybody together in this forum. We had an amazing afternoon yesterday. We had workshops around the crowdsourcing space in sort of the microtasking area, learning about best practices and use cases and who was doing what. I wanted to thank some of the speakers that we had yesterday that aren't presenting today. We had John from Amazon, Mira from Xerox, Chong from Walmart, Patrick from LinkedIn, Neo all the way from Japan, thanks for coming over, from Yahoo Japan, Subroto, who is from Genpact in India, Maya from IBM Watson Labs, Anhe from Walmart, a couple of other people that have come a long way to be with us. We've got Mr. Darzi, Mr. Aslan from Malaysia. We'll talk about a little bit more about those later. Trolls, thank you very much for coming over with your colleague from Denmark. Arthur, I met this morning from ABN AMRO, came over from Holland. We've got a presentation from Arthur and Korstian from Simbid in Holland. So we had a really great discussion. We've got some of the leading companies in the world that are disrupting the way that we think about how to engage with customers, design products, how we process work. So I know you'll enjoy listening to the content and networking with those people and hearing a number of great presenters during the course of today. So if you're brave enough, put your hands up if you saw Instagram coming. So, okay, well, unfortunately, I didn't see it either, okay, and Kodak didn't see it, and there's a lot of other companies that didn't see it. Who saw iStock Photo coming along and rattling Getty Photos? Anybody see that one coming? Okay, you saw that. Well, there's a reason why you saw that, because you've moved on it. Airbnb, Zipcar, okay? You know, I mean, how long is it going to be before the traditional models for renting and hiring cars completely changes? We've got a presentation later today from a new company called Zipments, okay? So maybe we're going to get early sight on how FedEx and UPS, etc., are going to be shaken up, okay? And the reason I'm mentioning these is this is a really opportune time for us to get an early sight of things that are going to happen and things that are being disrupted. Last year, through our own research, we know that $1.3 billion was invested into the crowd business model community. That's crowdsourcing and crowdfunding. And our research showed the year before that was closer to about $350 million. So if we're in an enterprise responsible for innovation, then the way that we identify, one way that we can identify what's happening in the areas that we should be thinking about developing our businesses is looking at these startups and looking at these businesses that are getting funded. So I just mentioned a list of companies there, and some of us may not even know those new companies, but let's take something like Accenture and Deloitte, okay? Who, as a big enterprise, who are you going to be buying services off in 3, 4, 5 years' time? Is it going to be Accenture, is it going to be Deloitte, or is it going to be a company that you haven't heard of? So one of our presentations early this morning is we have Topcode, and Topcode were formed in 2001. One of the most inventive companies in terms of one of the first organizations to create challenge-based competitions for experts around computer programming, developing algorithms and things of that nature. And, earlier this week, a company called Apiro that I hadn't heard of before acquired Topcoder. And Apiro has already received $60 million in funding from the likes of General Atlantic and Sequoia, who have a tendency not to get too many things wrong. So now you've got a systems integration cloud company that provides traditional infrastructure services, consulting services, that already has crowd as part of its model, buying a 10-year-old or 12-year-old leading company that has a community of 500,000 expert coders. Okay? These are the types of moves that we can get early sight of by attending things like this and talking about these types of models. And a lot of today is, you know, our wish for today is that you leave understanding, number one, that crowd is really important in terms of an enterprise strategy. If you're an enterprise, a government, or an institution, you need to be thinking about it holistically as a strategy. So that's number one. And then number two, obviously, we're going to talk today about how crowd affects innovation, growth, sales, and engagement with customers. So we hope you leave with some ideas on how to take this forward. So we really, really believe that crowdsourcing is the next generation, the next wave of the distribution of work. And we think this is going to be much, much bigger than the change that happened when services moved from inside the enterprise to outside the enterprise and then became globalized. Now, when that happened, things got cheaper, but they didn't necessarily get better. I mean, they might have got better because the provider was really good, but fundamentally there was no implicit benefit or enhancement of quality necessarily within those types of models. But crowdsourcing is very different to that. So with crowdsourcing, obviously, you can produce a lot more work, you can do it faster, you can do it cheaper. It's a 100% variable model in many instances. So it's the panacea of where we were trying to go with outsourcing for 25 years but never quite got there. So today we're going to be talking about it both from the perspective of how you perform work, but also other ways of getting market data, how you engage with customers, and of course this whole area of crowdfunding. And if you're scratching your head and thinking, well, why have we got crowdfunding on the agenda? Because crowdfunding is about money. Well, crowdfunding is about a lot more than just money. One of the first people that I contacted that I wanted part of this presentation today, this session today, was Arthur from ABN AMRO. For the last 2 years, they've been investing in a crowdfunding platform. So why is an international bank investing in a crowdfunding site? Well, we're going to find out today. We've got Alon from Invested In talking about use cases with Coca-Cola and ABT Financial. So some big enterprise plays in the crowdfunding area, but it's not just about the money. And I won't steal any of their secrets there. So, you know, crowdfunding and crowdsourcing as a model that's being explored and being investigated, it's off the charts, okay? Growing exponentially. You've got a workforce of crowd workers now at about 10 million. You've got a financial market within the crowdfunding sector growing at about 85% a year. We produce reports on this. If you're interested in understanding that composition, we can provide that information. So these are really, really hot topics, and enterprises now are starting to explore them in a lot more detail. If it's not already clear, I want to make sure that people understand that this is, you know, this is systemic. This is not something that's going to go away. And I want to try and explain what are the components, how are the things been put together that have led up to this point in time. So there were some early examples of sort of open source projects. Obviously, the formation of the gene bank sequence database, it's the most relied upon source of information for biological research. We've got things like SETI, which was a pooling of capacity, everybody's PCs looking for extraterrestrials. I don't think they've found anybody yet, but there was an awful lot of people very willing to share their resources. Of course, you've got Linux. One of the things that we think as part of the ability to do crowdsourcing and crowdfunding is the development of payment systems. And before, it was easy to move small amounts of money around without it being encumbered by a cost that made it prohibitive. It was very difficult to engage and pay people for doing little pieces of work or to send small amounts of money in the forms of donations and things of that. So the payment industry through the 90s didn't really pick up, but obviously with PayPal in 98 and then more recently there are many forms of micropayments now. I mentioned Topcoder, 2001. There were a couple of seminal books. So Wisdom of Crowds was one of the first. So then of course, all of a sudden, you get people that are responsible for researching, looking forward, trying to understand how these models are being created, start writing about them. So we start becoming more aware of them. In 2005, Amazon went from selling books in English to selling books in every language to selling everything in every language everywhere. Okay? And the way they did that, the first thing they had to do was to create a catalogue to allow people to compare one product to another and see if it was exactly the same. Now remember the story. When they went and explained how they were going to do that by hiring a bunch of people, they were told, well, we already have a lot of people. We have our customers. They're already online. They're connected to us. They know our products. They turned that into a workforce, and that's Amazon Mechanical Turk. So they've got capacity coming in. Jeff Howe publishing his book and calling it Crowdsourcing in 2006, and it was his fault that I'm doing this now. Okay. And then of course we've got things like Cambrian House, one of the first examples of a sort of an ideation platform. I think there were 7,000 product ideas, a community of 50,000 people. Cambrian House in 2007 became Chaotix. We've got Shelley here somewhere from Chaotix. Hi Shelley at the back. So again, a company that's been disrupting and creating this sort of change, one of the early players. Dolores Labs, our friends from Crowdflower. 2007, I think 2009 rebranded as Crowdflower. So Dolores Labs, one of the first companies to start building systems to put machines and people together, basically, and obviously taking that into the enterprise space. And then you've got us. We can claim that we started working on the taxonomy for the industry, so the way that the industry forms around the use cases and the definitions and things of that nature, which is really the structure for our work and for our consulting advisory. We started that in 2008. We launched in 2010 our industry website and our consulting and research business. Crowd computing systems. There are many companies here you could mention. One of the first companies to build the architecture, the infrastructure to allow enterprises to start integrating their own crowds, hybrid crowds, private and public crowds, and then new companies like Allegion and companies that are now producing this software for enterprises to build their own models as opposed to just buy managed services. And then of course in the last few years you've got many more payment systems. We've got nearly 3 billion, well 2.5 billion people online, and infrastructure that's very pervasive and reaching, so you can engage and organize these communities. So in terms of the type of work, I mean, fundamentally, 3 categories of work. You can use it to perform work, simple tasks, micro tasks, things that are more complex. You can use it for problem solving. Those problem solvings can be business issues. They can be grand challenges like cleaning up oil spills and things of that nature. Or you can use it in the form of asset formation. This is about capital formation, but people are pooling spare capacity in their homes, their vehicles, other types of assets and things. Mark, you going to say any words? I'm going to introduce you. Mark's chairman of our advisory board, and very grateful that he's here today.
Is the microphone turned on okay back there? Thank you very much. Thanks, Carl. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for coming this morning. I appreciate it. I see a lot of familiar faces. I see a lot of new ones. I want to thank the sponsors and Carl and the team that put on a great conference both yesterday and today. What I'd like to touch on is briefly some of my experiences in big developmental changes like crowdsourcing. I think for most people in the general public, the mass market, it's been more business to consumer. You know, you see things like Wikipedia or Uber or Yelp, and if the multiples will be higher, they'll start calling themselves crowdsourcing. But they've been doing this, and as Carl traced, you know, the lineage of this, it's quite lengthy. And I've seen other developments like this in my career, from client-server to shared services to functional transformation to IT outsourcing, to business process outsourcing, to the internet, to B2B exchanges. And in my opinion, crowdsourcing will be more ubiquitous and more pervasive than all of those because it hits so many business functions and processes. And Carl kindly put up some examples here to just give you a flavor for how pervasive it already is. Just to kind of scroll through these, there's more information on the Crowdsourcing.org. And you're going to hear different case studies today from people who are doing these. It's quite extensive, and I think most enterprises don't understand how extensive crowdsourcing can really be. And I think that's for a variety of reasons. I think enterprises are extremely risk averse. I think some of the crowdsourcing vendors underestimate how hard it is to get these enterprises to adopt your services. And enterprises were very risk averse to offshoring. They were risk averse to outsourcing. They were risk averse to re-engineering. So when I think about the challenges for crowdsourcing, you know, one is regulation. You know, governments try to outlaw it initially in certain cases. That can be worked through dealt with more sensitive subjects than crowdsourcing. Another one is the internet. Any of you have been involved in an IPO or seen an S1, there's always a risk there that says our business depends on the internet. If that goes down, we're in trouble. A lot of people are in trouble, not just crowdsourcers, but it is a risk. But the third one, I think, is the culture of the enterprises themselves. And the enterprises that are here today, I commend them for really trying to understand this and how it's going to impact their business, because the behavior is a lot of, I don't want to lose my job, this sounds very radical, and a culture of being proximity-based and having to see your workers and the command and control. And crowdsourcing goes against all that. You don't see the workers, you see the output. They're not in your offices, they're somewhere else. You're communicating via Skype or the internet, and that bothers a lot of enterprises. So when you look at your stakeholders internally and you're trying to get these initiatives adopted, you can't underestimate identifying the right stakeholders and driving that change through. And not all enterprises are fortunate enough to have a visionary founder who will hammer through the organization to get that done. Many of them are much more risk averse than that. So I would not underestimate that. It's a challenge. I will say that for me and my experience with enterprises, today you will learn what the crowdsourcing vendor landscape looks like. You will learn how to tee up these projects and how to get the change management curve through that. You will realize how much crowdsourcing is going on in your organization that you didn't already know about. You will learn how many of your employees, hopefully over time, are signed up on crowdsourcing platforms, and maybe you can monetize that instead of the employees just doing it on their own by an employer-sponsored crowdsourcing. So I do believe this is more ubiquitous and pervasive than these other changes. I'm going to hand it back to Carl so we can introduce our keynote from Lego. And thank you very much for attending today.
Thank you.